What's up everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video for the First Descendant today, we are looking at Valby. Now something which I think comes as no surprise to anyone is that of course this game has a meta and the meta is very much intact. Since the beginning of Season 3, there are some Descendants who are just exceptionally good at doing every single bit of content in the game, stretching all the way from the most difficult bosses to the most difficult mobbing content and everything in between. That is the meta. However, what has also become apparent is that there's a tier just below the meta tier of Descendants who are exceptionally good at one or two of those different pieces of content that I mentioned now, while not necessarily being the tippy top or the meta in the other. In other words, making them the selection just below meta. However, these Descendants should not be ignored because they are either exceptionally fun to play or really good at doing that specific piece of content that it almost trivializes the effort to actually play it. Now, Valby is a very good example of that because in the setup that I'm going to show you today, she is capable of mobbing with such incredible ease that you'll literally just be standing there, just pressing one button the entire time to delete entire screens. Of course, you're more than welcome to jump around and swing and do all the usual shit that we do while we farm. But you could also just stand there with a beer in your other hand and just watch enemies melt away. Now, while Valby hasn't necessarily been reworked or anything like that, with the Season 3 patch, of course, we had the introduction of trigger modules and stuff, which of course can increase the damage profile, and in her case, it definitely does. And then at the same time as well, one of her Transcendent mods, Waterplay, actually received a pretty significant damage buff, which is the reason for me making this build today. So Waterplay used to deal its damage once per second, and that was changed in the patch to twice per second, so on a 0.5 second interval. Now this is pretty significant because the whole point of this build is essentially pouring this fucking water all over the floor, and then as enemies spawn or walk through the shit, they basically die. And this build does that very thing very good. So every single mobbing content in the game, from Axion all the way to Void Erosion Purge, is easy peasy lemon squeezy with this build. And you're actually also still able to kill pretty much, I would say, all of the let's say Void Intercept bosses up until Gluttony, I think, with pretty good, you know, efficiency. And probably, you know, if you want to do it, you could probably take it into Wall Crasher and probably deal a bunch of damage to Wall Crasher as well. However, these days, if you don't show up with a meta Descendant in Wall Crasher, people tend to cuss you out. So I don't know what's up with that. But that being said, you should play whatever you feel like playing. And if you're looking for a Descendant that's a little bit off the meta, but still deals just as much damage as you would expect a meta Descendant to deal, then look no further than this Descendant and this build. Let's have a look at it. This is Valby. So right off the rip, let's go ahead and look at the Descendant modules. Now, as I mentioned, Waterplay is the Transcendent mod of choice that we want to use here. This is, by the way, a module that's available for Ultimate Valby as well as normal Valby, so you don't need Ultimate Valby to do this. So if you've only ever got normal Valby, guess what, this shit will still work just fine for you, and you can absolutely build this. Ultimate Valby is not required. But basically what this says is it creates a rectangular shaped puddle of water in front of Valby. By usual, her first skill, what it does is it rolls out this like plop, like little dots of water that bounces, and on every bounce its damage increases. What Waterplay does is instead it makes this wave that pushes out from you, and in my opinion is far superior because it's much easier to control exactly where the damage goes, and also because of the fact that with the right selection of modules, you can actually make this area that this water covers fucking ginormous. In other words, you can just with 2 or 3 casts of this cover an entire room. And also bear in mind that how her skills work is they work on overlap. So 1 layer of water deals damage, 2 layers of water deals 2 sets of damage, 3 layers of water deal 3 sets of damage. You get the point. You can stack these on, and this is where you can see the damage really start to fly off when you have 2, 3, 4 pools lying on top of each other and a fucking boss wanders onto that shit and then proceeds to, you know, wet himself. So the main point is, yes, you can absolutely dive with plop, you can do cleanup, you can fucking shoot your laundry bomb and everything that you want. But if you want to see the real damage pop off with this build, and if you want to see like the stuff that you saw in the clips at the beginning of the video, then you're just going to be wanting to use Waterplay. You're just going to use your first ability, and you're just going to throw this out on cooldown the entire time. And since we're going to drop our cooldown down into the fucking ground, you're going to be able to do this a lot of times because the cooldown is 1.5 seconds. So you're just going to be able to push this out until the cows come home. So the bottom line here is we want to stack the size of our first ability. We want to bring the cooldown down as much as possible, and then we just want to pile a lot of damage on top of that. As a side note, you can also look at duration. Duration is important for us because it's how long the pool of water stays on the ground dealing damage. And of course, since this build works on overlap, the point is the longer you have the pools on top of each other, the more your damage is essentially multiplied. So starting us off from a cooldown perspective, all right, we want nimble fingers because that's going to give us skill cooldown minus 25.6%, and we also want MP conversion. That's another massive skill cooldown for us as well at another negative 36.5%. At the same time, we can also use the focus mods because they give us not only damage, but they also give us cooldown reduction. So focus on non-attribute because again, our damage profile is non-attribute and fusion. All right, so focus on non-attribute gives us non-attribute skill power and some more skill cooldown, and focus on fusion, you guessed it, gives us fusion skill power modifier as well as some skill cooldown. That covers all of our cooldown, and in combination with stuff that we're going to get from the Arche Tuning board and also from our Reactor, that's how we get to this 1.5 second cooldown. Now, does it need to be as low as that? No, arguably you'd be fine with something around 2 seconds or so on, but the point of this build is this is your main damage dealer and you want this available the entire time, and the more of these that you have available, the more you can stack them up and the more you can essentially just, you know, milk enemies with damage. So the point is have this cooldown as low as possible. Again, but 1.5 seconds is, I don't think you get much lower than that, so that's about as good as it gets. The next thing we want to do, as mentioned, is we want to increase the size, right? So the benefit that you have with this thing, with water play, is the size itself. You can see that it has a range, and this range is 2 multipliers. So it's 7 meters times 2 meters. Now, that's because when you change the size of this, you affect its fucking girth. In other words, its thickness as well as its length, okay? So basically, range is really, really good for us here. What it does is it increases, you know, us on both sides. So it doesn't just make the line longer, it doesn't just make it thicker, it does both of those things. So by pushing a lot of range into this and getting very close to the range cap, which is 300%, which is dope as shit, you can make these super, super big. And like I said, especially in Axion, when you go down and you're in those, you know, enclosed areas, you can cover an entire fucking tunnel or an entire room with like 2 of these casted. So it's just really good shit. Now, in terms of the size, what you want to go for is skill expansion. That's going to give us skill effect range of 92.3%. And then you can throw in amplification control, which also gives us skill effect range of plus 51.7%. Now, with these two and the range increase that we get on our arc tree, we get very, very close to being capped. All right, so this is I think the best possible setup here. We are not capped fully. However, also with our what is it called, inversion reinforcement, after a couple of stacks of that, then you actually do become range capped. So the point is, this is enough for us. We don't need to mess around with maximize or anything like that, and that gives us enough range to essentially have it at mass potential. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to stack the duration, as I said. Okay, so skill extension is the only one that we throw in here. Skill duration of plus 36.5%, and by default this water shit stays on the ground for 10 meters. So when you slap this on, it goes to 13.6 meters. So the point is, since you're on a 1.5 second cooldown on casting it, you can get, at the very least, if you're like super slow, you can get 5 to 6 of these like lying on top of each other and dealing damage for at least a second of 2. And that's like, I would describe that as being like critical fucking mass. That's when you're dealing like your most possible damage. But even just 2 or 3 or 4 of these pools lying on top of each other absolutely melts fucking health bars. So it's all good. Then after that, we have 3 more slots to talk about. Now, we definitely want to push in more damage. And since this is a non-crit build, this is just a raw power build, it means that we can use the amp mods. Fusion amplification gives us a fusion skill power modifier, but tanks our critical hit rate. And where the fuck is it? Non-attribute amplification gives us non-attribute skill power, and it tanks our skill critical hit damage. Again, doesn't matter because we're not building for crit, so this is all good. That leaves us with what I call a flex slot. I generally conclude this for almost all my builds, because I do tend to build a little bit glass cannony. So oftentimes people will look at the stats of my build and go, dude, that's 7,000 HP, that's way too little, I fucking die, all this stuff. So in that case, I say look at the flex slot and throw some HP in there if you're not surviving. Or in the case of like my case, if you want to live on the fucking edge and you want to deal as much damage as possible, then you can use this flex slot to further on increase your damage. Now, I use non-attribute Syncytium in here because it gives us non-attribute skill power of plus 10.2%. But Dangerous Ambush, you could also use that here, because the point is, enemies as they spawn in the water, they still haven't targeted you, they're still busy spawning, so you do get that increase of damage to them. However, I will say this to you, and as you've seen in the footage was recorded with this exact setup, and we were melting enemies as soon as they fucking spawn. So Dangerous Ambush is not necessarily going to give you that much more bang for your buck. However, where Dangerous Ambush can help you is in cases where you tow the enemies, which we're going to look at just now, which you can do, or in cases of if you decide to use this to kill some void intercept bosses, and you are able to push those void intercept bosses into a fucking stun state, which will then mean that you get a massive amount of additional damage. But that's Dangerous Ambush. As I said, you can throw some survivability in here, so some more HP or something like that if you want. If you want a good how can I say, middle ground between survivability and more damage, then Spear and Shield, which gives you more defense and also some skill power, is also an option here. So really, the sky's the limit. Treat this as something that, you know, you can experiment with. If you're happy with the survivability here, then try some of the other damage options and you should be good to go. So I'm going to leave it like this for a second, just in case you want to screenshot it or something like that, just to get the mods. And then we can talk about our trigger module. Now, I tested a bunch of different trigger modules. Power Beyond happens to be probably the best trigger module in the game right now, just because of the fact that it works on all Descendants, because it gives it skill power increase to all fucking Descendants that use skill power. So regardless of if your abilities actually trigger the mod itself, you get this skill power increase flat. So that just makes this rise above most other, you know, trigger modules. But that being said, specifically with Valby, you actually get the benefit of this mod because her skill can actually do the tow. So, meaning every once in a while, as you use your ability, you'll notice that your water will tow a bunch of enemies, aka pull them onto each other, okay? And this will lower their damage output, and at the same time, you will then also, like for example, if you're using Dangerous Ambush or something like that, you will get that additional damage because they are incapable, what is it called? Fucking, I forget the name. They are immobilized. All right, but I mean, that's not the reason to put in Dangerous Ambush. I'm just telling you like how things will break down if you use the skills. But the bottom line is this tow effect is kind of dope, though. Oftentimes this will be enemies that are a little bit tougher and haven't died to the initial wave of your water play, and then this will just stack them all on top of one another so that you can just throw the rest of your water right on them and it'll hit all of them in a group. It works really well. This is a fantastic fucking trigger module for Valby specifically. Okay, then moving us over to weapons. Of course, Valby is a non-attribute Descendant, and then furthermore, you are dealing damage of the fusion variety. Now that means that this weapon over here, Peacemaker, is your best possible option, okay? And that's because any non-attribute Descendants, well, it doesn't have to be non-attribute, but to trigger the effect, but you get the benefit only for non-attribute, that deal dimensional fusion will get this effect here, which is basically a massive damage buff. So just by casting out this water shit the whole time, you're going to be stacking this damage buff here, and you're going to be getting a massive amount of increased non-attribute skill power, which will just drive your dots to deal that much more damage. Now, you don't need to, this is a stat stick, so you don't need to build this out. The other reason why Peacemaker is really good is because its cores are very good for setting up as a stat stick, meaning like you can put 2 sprint speed and a grappling hook charge time increase like I've done here, which will mean that you move faster across the battlefield and your grappling hook also comes back faster. So both of those just making your movability a lot better, right? Your mobility. Now, in terms of mods, if you do want to just put some mods on here, Defense Master and Tactical Change is good mods for a stat stick, because when you switch between your weapons, you engage both these mods and they make you more durable. However, that's not necessary at all. You can keep this fucking gun empty completely and just run around with it in your hands, and as long as you know, you have this in your hands, you get the additional benefit of the damage, and also then of course making sure that you also have that actually mounted to your reactor, so that goes without saying, so that you get the additional reactor damage. Now, speaking of Reactor, and maybe I should just quickly move my face over there. Of course, as mentioned, our damage profile is non-attribute and fusion, so materialized mixture is what we're looking for. So making sure that you are mounted here. Of course, this weapon, Peacemaker, is a hand cannon, so make sure you have a hand cannon mounting, and then you get the 160 skill power additional there. Then in terms of your substats on the Reactor, because we're not building crit or anything like that, we don't have to worry about something like, you know, additional crit damage or so, because we're not using this to attack Colossi. We don't need that. I think the best in slot here is something like 1 damage boost and 1 skill cooldown. So, or not 1 skill cooldown, but skill cooldown. There's not multiple skill cooldowns. So you can, in my case, I went for non-attribute skill power boost ratio and skill cooldown, which is one of my damage buckets, and then skill cooldown itself, helping me to get to that 1.5 second cooldown on my first ability. However, you could go skill cooldown and duration if that's the only thing you can find, which will drop your damage a little bit, but you'll have the additional pool time that the pool lies on the ground. And I think you could also, I mean, if you can't find non-attribute skill power boost ratio, then I suppose in a pinch, fusion skill power boost ratio and skill cooldown is also fine. But I do believe that skill cooldown is kind of like imperative to have as a substat, just to get that super low cooldown on your first ability. In terms of your external components, like literally the set that I use the most at the moment now in the fucking game, Enlightened Mage. Enlightened Mage is a skill damage set, but more specifically, it's a skill damage set focused on non-attribute Descendant. So its 2 set bonus gives you a skill power increase, and its 4 set bonus is Truth, which after 3 stacks gives you a non-attribute skill power increase of 84%, which is ginormous. And because you're casting your one ability the entire time, you will have this buff active the entire time. So that's just a big old buff damage to you right there. In terms of your substats though, or rather let's talk about the mods first. You want to go max HP and defense on all 4 of your pieces, because this is one of the best ways for you to just stack up your survivability a little bit. That's going to mean that if you have all 4 of these upgraded, you're going to be sitting at just below 7k HP and 40k of defense, which again, like I said, some people see this as very glass cannon, and therefore you could use that flex slot that I was talking about before, and when you drop some HP in there, I think you'll go all the way up to 13.5, almost 14,000 HP, which is a lot more manageable, I think, for some people, and makes them feel a little bit safer on the battlefield. Now, in terms of substats on your Enlightened Mage, of course, you want to go for, I would say, the standard here, which is MP recovery out of combat and max HP. You want to go for max HP and MP recovery in combat on your sensor. On your memory, you want defense and MP recovery modifier. And then lastly, your processor doesn't really matter. There's not really great substats for us to pick up here. So you can do poison resistance and max shield, or max shield recovery modifier, or max shield and poison, whatever, anything like that, that'll work. So that's basically your setup for those 4. Then next up, we have Arche Tuning. Over here, I would say this is a pretty standard setup for like a skill-based Descendant that is not focusing on crit. So what you're going to do is you're going to go this way, you're going to grab yourself some skill cost reduction, you're going to grab yourself some range over here, pick up the yellow node here, then all the way up, get yourself the skill cooldown over here, and then peel your way around to your mutant cell, which in this case is non-attribute cohesion, which is a 3 stackable buff force of non-attribute skill power, which you get from defeating enemies, which, you know, you're mobbing, so that's what you're doing. So you're going to be having this buff active all the time as well. Now, if you complete this path as this, you're going to have 4 points left over. Those 4 points, I'll put 1 down here and these 2 here to get to this skill power here, and then my 4th last point will be some HP here. However, those 4 points you can use however you want. If you want to add yourself some more MP recovery modifier or something like that, then of course feel free to go ahead. Then our last thing will be Inversion Reinforcement, and I think I need to go ahead and move my face over there again. Maybe that's the right thing to do. And over here you have some choices to make that can help you out with survivability as well. In terms of MP maintenance, you can definitely take selective neurostimulation, which is really good and can help you in a pinch if you are in longer fights and you're starting to run a little bit low on MP and you haven't been picking up blue bricks. This can be a godsend. Of course, Arc Circulation Tactic is massive as well, because basically this will just crunch your skill cooldowns even more. This might be overkill, honestly, because our skill cooldowns are so low already. However, this is something that you can take if, for example, you are one of the people that you don't have 1.5 seconds skill cooldown. Maybe you're sitting at 2 or 2.2 seconds or something, based on some changes that you made to the build different to mine. Then this can be big for you, because it can actually give you some decent skill cooldown as well for at least like certain parts of the fight. I like shield particle reconfiguration for survivability as well. This is oftentimes also something that I suggest to people if they want to give themselves a little bit more survivability. This says that it essentially, when you're hit by an enemy, grants you this buff. This is defense 10% times and max shield plus 2.5% times per 2,500 defense for 15 seconds. Now, you have a fairly substantial amount of defense, I would say, because of the way that you're stacking your external components. They're sitting at about 40k, so that's a pretty big multiplier for you. However, I think that this configuration gives sort of like the best compromise here. You can, of course, also go for focus boost instead of this. If you're happy with your cooldown being what it is, then focus boost can also help you to just get more of those skills out on the MP bar that you have. And then, I mean, if you wanted a small amount of additional duration, then I suppose you could do that as well. But yeah, there's a couple of different options here in terms of survivability. I would say play around with it. The most important thing I would say is to make sure that you're able to actually gain access to quantum domain. This is a range increase for us, which helps us to get to the range cap, and it's also a skill power increase for us. So this is a good one to open up first, because this will give you a bigger damage profile, and it's kind of like really good before you get the other ones. The other ones also help with some survivability, but this one is kind of clutch in terms of just your damage profile. And that's going to be it for the build. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Let me know how you've set your Valby up. Do you partake in the water play? Do you enjoy Valby as much as I do? Between her and Viesa, both of these Descendants have really surprised me recently, but just how good they are now, how good they feel to play. Pretty much for the last, I would say, 4 days, I've been grinding just with Valby because it just makes everything so easy. And yeah, it's just a fantastic way to also just level your weapons and everything like that, because even if you don't have your weapon in your gun that's mounted, you're still dealing more than enough damage to actually do the mobbing content with relative ease. And so therefore it's also just a great way to blast through 400% infiltrations or Sigma and level some stuff and level some other weapons. But that's it for the video. Again, thanks for watching. Please continue watching. Lots more videos coming. We have the big September 4th patch coming this week as well. So that's bringing us Ultimate Luna, which means more videos, more stuff. Can't wait to show you guys what I got cooking. Other than that, as always, fucking cheers.